Keystones Unearthed. I'm August Vane. Tonight. The land that drowned overnight. 10,000 years ago, if you stood on the coast of what is now the Netherlands and looked north toward England, you would not have seen open water. You would have seen more land, rolling hills, river valleys, forest, stretching to the horizon. Where the North Sea sits today, geologists and archaeologists now agree there was once a wide, low landmass connecting mainland Europe to Britain by dry, walkable ground. Researchers call it Doggerland, and at its largest it covered an area roughly the size of the United Kingdom itself. The name comes from Dogger Bank, a large shallow sandbank that still rises close to the surface of the modern North Sea. Dogger Bank marks the highest ground of what was once Doggerland's rolling terrain, the last part still visible on any modern chart. The first hint that something had once been there came almost by accident. In 1931, a fishing trawler called the Colinda dredged up a fragment of worked antler in its nets while working the North Sea, far from any coastline, an unmistakable sign of ancient human toolmaking. That single antler point, later dated to roughly 13,000 years old, forced geologists to take seriously an idea that had previously been speculative, that solid, inhabited ground had once existed exactly where that trawler had been fishing. In the decades since, hundreds more artifacts have surfaced the same way: flint tools, worked wood, and animal bones pulled up incidentally by commercial fishing vessels working the North Sea, sometimes 50 kilometers or more from the nearest modern shoreline. For thousands of years before it disappeared, Doggerland supported Mesolithic hunter-gatherer communities who fished its rivers, hunted red deer and wild boar across its plains, and tracked herds of mammoths still roaming parts of northern Europe at the time. As the last ice age drew to a close roughly 12,000 years ago, enormous ice sheets across the northern hemisphere began melting steadily, and global sea levels rose year after year, gradually eating into Doggerland's lower ground. For most of this period, the change was slow and generational, not sudden. Each generation living on Doggerland would have watched the coastline creep inward a little further, river mouths widen, and low pastureland gradually turn to marsh. Then, around 8,200 years ago, everything changed abruptly. Off the coast of Norway, an enormous underwater landslide occurred, now known as the Storegga Slide, one of the largest submarine landslides ever documented anywhere on Earth. The Storegga Slide displaced a colossal volume of seawater and triggered a tsunami that radiated outward across the North Sea basin, striking the coastlines of what are now Scotland, Norway, and whatever remained of Doggerland's shrinking high ground. Geologists have found and dated sediment layers along the Scottish coastline that precisely match this event, a sudden deposit of sand and marine debris consistent with a powerful wave striking dry land without warning. For anyone still living on the lower reaches of Doggerland at the time, this would have been a violent, sudden catastrophe, sharply different from the slow, generational retreat their ancestors had adapted to for centuries beforehand. Some higher elevations, protected by hills and dense forest cover, likely survived the tsunami as isolated islands for a few more centuries afterward, slowly shrinking further as sea levels continued their steady rise. By approximately 5,500 BC, the geological evidence indicates the North Sea had finally claimed the last remnants of dry ground, permanently severing the land connection between Britain and the European mainland. In 2008, dredging work off the Dutch coast turned up something remarkable: a fragment of a human skull, later confirmed through dating to be roughly 9,500 years old, a direct physical trace of someone who once lived on Doggerland itself. Since 2015, a major research initiative called Europe's Lost Frontiers, led by archaeologist Vince Gaffney at the University of Bradford, has systematically mapped Doggerland's lost rivers, hills, and coastlines using seismic survey data. Much of that seismic data was never originally collected for archaeology at all. It came from oil and gas exploration companies, who had spent decades scanning the North Sea floor for entirely different commercial reasons, and whose old survey archives turned out to be an archaeological goldmine. In 2019, researchers working with this data located the remains of a submerged ancient forest, tree trunks still rooted in place on the modern sea floor, standing exactly where Doggerland's woodlands would have grown 10,000 years earlier. No confirmed village or permanent settlement site has yet been located beneath the North Sea. The search remains genuinely difficult, expensive, dependent on borrowed industrial data, and searching an area of open water roughly the size of a small country. Researchers have also identified what megafauna once shared this landscape with its human inhabitants, based on bones recovered in trawler nets: woolly mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and giant deer, all part of the same ecosystem that vanished along with the land itself. Modern researchers have taken to calling Doggerland the Atlantis of the North Sea. Unlike the Atlantis of Greek legend, though, its existence and disappearance rest on solid, testable, physical evidence rather than a single ancient philosopher's story. It's worth being direct about one common misconception: Doggerland is not literally the Atlantis described by the Greek philosopher Plato. Plato's account places Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules and describes a sudden single-day catastrophe. Doggerland's disappearance took thousands of years, with only the final phase being abrupt. During its height, roughly during what climatologists call the Mesolithic climatic optimum, Doggerland's climate was notably warmer and wetter than the modern British Isles, supporting dense forest, extensive wetlands, and correspondingly rich hunting and fishing grounds. The ecosystem supported large herds of red deer, wild boar, and aurochs, the massive wild ancestor of modern domestic cattle, alongside smaller populations of the last mammoths still surviving in parts of northern Europe at the time. Underwater archaeology of this kind remains genuinely difficult and expensive. Unlike land excavation, every survey requires specialized vessels, sonar equipment, and diving or remote-operated technology, which is why so much of Doggerland's mapping has relied on repurposed industrial data rather than dedicated archaeological funding. Doggerland isn't the only prehistoric settlement lost to rising seas. Off the coast of modern Israel, the submerged Neolithic village of Atlit Yam, roughly 9,000 years old, includes stone structures, a well, and even a stone circle, all now sitting on the seabed. Comparing these sites gives researchers a broader, unsettling pattern. Across multiple, unrelated regions of the ancient world, entire coastal communities were displaced by the same global process of post-Ice Age sea level rise, each losing their land in similar, if independently, documented ways. Pollen analysis taken from core samples of the North Sea floor has allowed researchers to reconstruct Doggerland's changing vegetation in remarkable detail, tracking the shift from open tundra grassland immediately after the Ice Age to dense birch and pine forest as the climate warmed. Some of the most compelling artifacts recovered aren't tools at all, but worked amber, traded and carried across what was then dry land between regions that today sit on opposite sides of the North Sea, hinting at trade networks that predate agriculture entirely. The Europe's Lost Frontiers project has gone further than mapping, using environmental DNA extracted directly from seabed sediment cores to identify which plant and animal species were actually present in specific parts of Doggerland at specific points in time. That technique, still relatively new to archaeology, effectively lets researchers reconstruct a lost ecosystem's biodiversity without needing a single surviving bone, working entirely from genetic traces preserved in undisturbed mud for thousands of years. The name Doggerland itself wasn't coined until 1990s, by archaeologist Brian E. Coles, who first proposed treating the submerged region as a genuine, connected prehistoric landscape worth systematic study, rather than scattered incidental finds. Some researchers now argue Doggerland deserves recognition as one of the largest lost prehistoric territories in human history, roughly comparable in scale to a small European nation, submerged not by myth but by fully documented, dated geological process. What Doggerland ultimately represents, beyond a fascinating archaeological puzzle, is a fully documented case of an entire habitable landscape disappearing within the lived memory of the people who called it home. As modern sea levels rise again today, driven by a different but comparably fast-moving process, Doggerland has stopped being purely an item of ancient history. For many coastal researchers studying it now, it's increasingly treated as a preview. Look at the evidence. Decide for yourself. I'm August Vane.